G'day and welcome back for another Space Engineers tutorial. Today we're going to be building a ship that will take us all the way up into space, and while we're up there we may as well collect some stuff, and then we'll probably want to bring it back down since most of our stuff is down here. And to do that we're going to need some thrusters. There are three types of thrusters in Space Engineers. We got the ion, the atmo, and the hydrogen thrusters. Ion thrusters don't work so well in atmosphere, and we don't have the platinum that you need for their thruster components, so they're out. Atmospheric thrusters, these will work great to get us a few kilometers up, and then they'll quit because the atmosphere will get too thin, so they won't work either. And then we've got our hydrogen thrusters. These things produce a huge amount of thrust and work everywhere, but they also chew up a huge amount of fuel. But they're our option to go for, because they will work and get us all the way up and back as long as we have enough fuel. So let's clear off our second hotbar and start adding the blocks we need to build this ship that we're going to have. First off, we're going to need a control seat, so we'll add a cockpit. We're going to need a power source, and I'm going to use batteries since I'm not planning on staying up there terribly long, and if we're using hydrogen thrusters, I don't need much power to stay up there. I could add some solar panels if I wanted to stay up there longer, but I don't think we need those right now. We're going to need some hydrogen thrusters, we'll need a gyroscope. If we're going to find some resources while we're up there, an ore detector might be helpful, as well as an antenna to transmit that if we happen to get out of the ship in our suit. Then, we're going to need some cargo to bring stuff back. And due to the connections that are on it more than its size, I'm going to use a large cargo container, and that will start making sense soon. Then, we also will need a hydrogen tank as a fuel supply. And in case we decide to stay up there a little bit longer than our initial fuel supply allows us, we're also going to bring an O2H2 generator to refill that tank. We may need some small conveyor tubes for hooking things up, and a landing gear to start the whole construction off, as well as a connector to hook up to the base. There are a few other blocks that we may consider, but that should get us started. I'll be going through all of these again, so don't worry too much if that was a little quick. Like before, I'm going to start with a light armor block in the ground, place landing gear on top so that we can start our build, and add our little stalk. I'd like to place our cockpit on the side here, and it doesn't quite let me because it wants to place it where there's no attachment for the cockpit. If this looks a little bit different to you, such as this is the behavior you're seeing, it could be because auto rotate is on. Down in the bottom center of my HUD, you can see a toggle that's turning on and off as I press T. That is auto rotate. It's a behavior that means the block will effectively stick to whatever you're pointing at, but is not particularly helpful at times. So we're going to turn that off so that our home and insert, delete, page up, page down controls will be able to keep the block exactly in the rotation we want it. Then to be able to place this cockpit as I would like, I'm going to pop another block there, and then we can center our view on that block, allowing the cockpit to be placed. This construction I'm going to do a little bit differently to usual, in that I'm going to build every block as we go, because the connections between all the stuff on this ship are really, really important. Our cockpit has these connections on the rear and this one underneath. The next thing we're going to place on here is our O2H2 generator. This thing has a large port on one side and two small ports on the other. Those two small ports line up perfectly to our cockpit. But it's pretty easy to place this 90 degrees offset like that. Just keep in mind that those two tube-shaped objects, they need to be horizontal to keep the ports lined up to your horizontal cockpit. So, like that. Now that we've got a large port, what we're going to place is our hydrogen tank. This hydrogen tank has two large ports, one on each end, and then four small ports around its middle. It's 5x5 small grid blocks, so we need to make sure we've centered it properly when we place it on. And then we've got our hydrogen tank. We've still got a large port, and this is where our large cargo container comes in. Large cargo containers have three large ports on them. 1, 2, 3, and then the three other faces all have small ports. So if we line this up such that we've got a large port facing downwards, rearwards, and forwards, we'll have a spot to attach something that's large conveyor downward as well as rearward. And that's going to be helpful since we want to be able to attach a connector somewhere here. With those four blocks placed, it's time to place our first thruster. And the first thruster we're going to place is a large hydrogen thruster. This thing has four small ports around it, which you can provide fuel to it with, as well as one large on the rear. And we're going to attach it directly to that rearward port. As you can see from the components list, these thrusters require metal grids, so in order to build hydrogen thrusters you are going to need to find cobalt. Fortunately I already have in the previous tutorials, so I've got some to work with already. Then we need our power source, so let's pop it under here vertically like this. That's going to give us room to attach something to this large port, which we will be doing shortly. It does stick down a fair bit, so we're going to need to be mindful of that when we come into any landings. You could place this battery anywhere. I'm just putting it here as I feel like it will align reasonably with the rest of the design of the ship. Next thing, let's add our connector, which I'm going to place under here. Part of the reason I want to have the connector directly onto the large cargo container is that means we can move components through this connector into the cargo container if we want to use this to carry components later. If I attached it to this large port at the cockpit end of things, we'd only have the small link between the cockpit and the O2H2 generator for moving things through, which would stop us from transferring components from the connector through to our cargo container. Which is why we used a large cargo container. If we'd used a medium cargo container, its two large ports on either end would have made it a bit more difficult and required the use of a conveyor junction in order to pipe a connector up to the rest of the cargo system. That's a perfectly valid option. I just wanted to do it this way so I could show you one of the nice aspects of using this large cargo container. We're going to need a gyroscope, or maybe two, depending on how heavy this thing is. I'm going to put two on just in case, because I suspect that this thing, when fully loaded, will be quite hard to move, and it might be nice to have that extra power. Oops, almost out of hydrogen. We can then place our ore detector in the middle of these two, and our antenna I'm going to place underneath here, attached to our connector. Doesn't need to be here, I just popped it here because it was a spot that I felt it would be okay to hide it. Before we start placing directional thrusters onto this, there's something to keep in mind once we get to space, which is we're going to need oxygen. And there are a few ways we can go about that. We can go with just what's in our suit and hope that we can survive long enough up there with just that. We can also use ice in the O2H2 generator to fill the cockpit so that we can keep refilling our oxygen that way. A better solution to both of those would be to use something like our oxygen bottle that we've got here and maybe carry a few of those on our person, which is definitely a good solution and can allow you to survive up in space for a very long time. Or if you are concerned you may need to stay there even longer and would like to keep your personal inventory free, we can add an oxygen tank to our ship. Unfortunately, we can't use an oxygen farm on this ship since that is a large grid only block, and we don't really want to have any subgrids on our flying ship. So let's grab an oxygen tank. This thing, like our O2H2 generator, has two small ports on one end and one large port on the back, which conveniently fits very nicely onto our cockpit here, and also hangs down exactly as far as this battery. It's almost like I planned that. While we're talking about the oxygen tank, I'm going to show you a nice way to fill it up without having to use any ice at all, and that's by using vents. We can use vents attached to any port that's conveyed up to our oxygen tank. If we're in an oxygen-rich environment, we can set it to depressurize so that we can suck in air from outside and pump it into that tank. And now we need to think about which directions we need hydrogen thrust in. Since we're going to be in space and we won't have gravity to pull us in any particular direction, we're going to need thrusters in all six directions. So we'll need one there, at least one this way, at least one this way, and at least one this way. And I'm only going to use one for each of those. We've got this large thruster on the rear, so if we need to slow down rapidly, we can just turn and use it to slow us down. Then we're going to need one for reverse. I could just put it straight on the front here, but I'm not going to. The reason for that is I want to put a drill on here so that we can collect resources a bit faster if we find any. So we'll place a drill there. Now that we've got our drill, we don't have any forward-facing conveyor ports, so we'll need to add some. And because I tend to want some decent braking power, I'm going to add two of them. One to either side of this drill. So right now we've got all of the components for a basic functional ship, except it's not going to fly so well. We're going to have trouble landing this since we're only going to be able to land it facing upwards, since this thruster is the only one strong enough to hold up the weight of the ship against the gravity on Earth. We could add more hydrogen thrusters for lifting in the horizontal position, but instead what I'm going to do is add some atmospheric thrusters. One of the reasons I like to add atmospheric thrusters to my hydrogen-powered ships is that means I can get up a few kilometers in the atmosphere without using any hydrogen, so that can save me on fuel. And it can provide for a safe landing when you're coming back down. You could also make a safe landing if you use some parachutes. Parachutes can be quite advantageous in that way in that they don't require much power, whereas the atmospheric thrusters do. And it's reasonable to potentially have both, just in case you end up heading back to Earth when you are low on power and on hydrogen. So let's add some atmospheric thrusters. I'm going to add 4 along that side and 4 along this side as well. Now, our connection is in the wrong spot for what I'm wanting to do, so make a new connection, grind out the gap. Then, like with our other ships, we're going to need some forward thrust, some rearward thrust, just for symmetry's sake, I'm going to do the same on both sides. And then we're going to need some sideways thrust. This is looking like quite a lot of thrusters, so I'm going to place... And then we'll need some sideways thrust. I'm going to make that easy and pop them on top of the cargo container and on top of the hydrogen tank. So there we go, that's 2 thrusters forward, back, left and right, and 8 thrusters for lift. This ends up being quite an expensive construction. This is why I wanted to do this drill rig in the previous tutorial, so that we had enough materials to put this whole thing together. Before I disconnect this ship from its little holder over here, I should probably have somewhere we can hook up to the base. So what I was thinking I would do is place a couple of conveyors out here, just for the simplest, shortest, quickest way to do this. Just in case of the event of any power outages, let's place down some light armor blocks as well, just to cradle this thing and prevent it from dropping what has ended up being a fair way down, and we'll be straight onto our rover, which is not ideal. With our connector ready, let's go and hook ourselves up. We've got power, we've got our oxygen tank filled, and now that it's filled, I'm going to remove these air vents because they're going to get in the way of landing. Because if you have a look, this connector is at the exact same height as our battery and our O2 tank, so we're going to be resting on those 3 blocks. We should be safe. Oh, I forgot to do some of these thrusters. We would not be safe if I disconnected. I will have to fix those now. Goes to show it pays to check both sides of your ship to ensure that you've built everything that you thought you did. There we go. Disconnected from our landing gear, and we are hovering. I'm going to hop in the cockpit. I'm going to do a little test that I described when we were building our mining ship. So I'm going to boost upwards, and I don't even need to do more than that. But upwards, forwards, and rightwards or leftwards, and you use up your maximum power. You can see that my power usage goes to 100%. That's because I've got 1 battery and it's not enough. So when I land this thing back down, I'm going to add a second battery, and we're going to test to see if that's going to be enough to provide enough energy for all our atmospheric thrusters. As before, we're going to add our connector to our hotbar so that we can switch lock, and we'll lock to our base. And now you can see that our hydrogen thrusters just turned on. That's because our tank is starting to get filled by the O2H2 generator on the base as it has some ice. We hop back in the cockpit and have a look at our tank. Our hydrogen tank will start showing that it is partially filled. And if we look at our inventory, you'll see that the amount of ice we've got is going down rather rapidly. We're going to need to collect a fair bit of ice in order to get this thing fully fueled up so that we can head off to space. While this ship is sitting here, these hydrogen thrusters won't be using any fuel, but because we don't want to use them yet anyway, I'm going to make them into a group. So we're going to look for hydrogen. We're going to select all our thrusters, including the large one, and set these into a group. And this will be orbiter, hydrogen, thrust, save. We can then put that group on our hotbar as a toggle on-off, and we'll turn those off. Now I'm going to add that battery that I wanted to add, and I think in here will be a nice spot. There we go, we've got our extra battery. I'm going to disconnect from the base and then we'll do our flight test. So now when we thrust upwards, it's only 59%, and if we thrust forwards, leftwards, and upwards, it's 87%. So these two batteries can provide enough power output for all of our atmospheric thrusters, which is perfect. So I'm going to land, and then I'm going to collect a whole bunch of ice so that we can fuel up our hydrogen tank. With the way I've arranged things on this ship, it's worth noting that you will need to land very delicately, as it's quite easy to damage these batteries and the O2 tank when you're landing. And now the final few things we need to do to get this prepped for flight. We need the large hydrogen thruster with some thrust overrides on our hotbar. So we can do that by right-clicking on it, increase thrust override, and decrease thrust override. So the thrust override works by gradually upping the amount of force generated by that thruster, and we can titrate it as we need to keep us just under the Space Engineer's speed limit. If we were to push against the speed limit using some of that energy, that's wasted energy. It's not going to do anything for us. It's not fighting gravity, it's fighting against the immovable force that is the speed limit. So we want to keep just under the 100 meters a second speed limit so that we're moving fast and we are not wasting energy pushing against that barrier. Now, something I have noticed that is an inconsistent behavior with hydrogen thrusters is how this thrust override works. So what I'm going to do now is unlock from the base, grab one of our atmospherics. Let's grab this one, increase thrust override and decrease thrust override. The way that these thrust overrides normally work is that if I increase the thrust override from the thruster, and it's the one attached to the large container there, the ones in the opposing direction won't resist the force generated by the thruster on override. As you can see here, I'm gradually accelerating just under the force of that one thruster, while leaving my dampeners on to keep me off the ground and resisting gravity. When I bring this down to 0, those reversing thrusters will now slow me down and stop me. I am seeing a different behavior with hydrogen thrusters at the moment. Sometimes that will work, sometimes it won't. If I turn on my hydrogen thrusters, and then I increase the thrust override to the big rear thruster, you can see that the two on the side of the drill are trying to stop me moving, which is going to burn a lot of fuel. So what we need to do is go into our menu, find our hydrogen thrusters that are our backwards ones, and put them in a group as well. So we can switch them off so that we don't waste power resisting against our lifting large hydrogen thruster. So now we've got our backwards thrust and we'll toggle on off with that. I might remove these ones as well. Just before we go, I think there are a couple of blocks that might be of value to us. The first is something we haven't used yet, and that's a camera. The reason a camera is useful is that when we're in a cockpit, from third person, you can't really zoom in. It's kind of hard to see much other than the ship you're looking at. And from first person, we can't see a great deal either. So if we have a camera on board, we can use the zoom function of the camera to get a closer look at any nearby asteroids. I'm going to place let's use a 2x1 slope. And then we'll pop our camera on there. Now the orientation of the camera can sometimes be very obvious. Right now, if you squint enough, you might be able to make out the camera text. But the bit that I prefer to use as the way to orient the camera the correct way around is the little white dot in the bottom left. You can see in the image of the camera from the G menu, there's a white dot, and as long as you put the white dot of the model in the same place, your camera will be oriented the way you expect it to be. So this will be oriented the correct way up. And you can see now that it is. I think if I turn off my headlights, it's even more obvious. And the last thing to add are a few lights, just in case we end up on the dark side of an asteroid. I'll put a pair of spotlights on. I'm just going to throw them down here for now. Then, just for a bit of extra awareness, if we end up on the dark side of an asteroid, I'll pop a couple of interior lights on as well. Increase the maximum radius of our interior lights so that we see as far as we can. And then we are ready to take off. Disconnect from the base, boost up as fast as we can, but we do have to remember we don't want to push against Space Engineer's speed limit. That's wasted energy. Anything we push against that 100 meters per second speed limit is just gone. We haven't gotten any useful work for it. So like we'll do shortly with the hydrogen thrusters, we'll adjust our thrust as we go. In this case, I'm just pulsating my thrusters to keep myself near but not going over that speed limit to conserve a little bit of energy. And then with our hydrogen thrusters, we'll adjust the thrust ever so slightly as we need to so that we keep just below it and conserve our fuel as best as possible. The atmospheric thrusters will cut out soonish in about 2 kilometers. So I'm going to keep closer to the max because I'm not getting as much thrust from them anymore. And then when we start losing speed, even though they're on full bore, we'll switch to our hydrogen. Yep, here we go. We're starting to decelerate even though I'm pushing as hard as I can with those 8 thrusters. So, turn all our hydrogen engines on, turn our reverse off, flip, and start putting our max override up. So there we go. Thrust override's at maximum. We're accelerating. We're at the speed limit, so let's start winding it back until we start to lose some speed. And then, just make sure we're as lined up to vertical as possible. And we just have to keep adjusting to keep ourselves close to, but not going over, not pushing against that speed limit. We will leave the pull of the Earth at about 40,000 meters, so we've got a fair way to go. We're 10 kilometers up, and if, like me, you've got a base marker, you can use that as a nice way to have a view of the Earth as we fly up. We could also put our ore detector on our hotbar to save a little bit of power, and our antenna. So we'll toggle that off, and we'll toggle that off as well. And now we've got 3 hours of power where we only had 2 just before. I definitely would recommend charging your ship at least a bit more than I have, since you may end up wanting to stay up in space a little bit longer than just a couple of hours. Especially if you struggle to find what you're looking for on the asteroids up in space. They can be quite difficult to search through, and time consuming. So it's worth keeping in mind that you might need a bit more power than you've saved, than I started with. We are very nearly outside the reach of the planetary gravity well. On the right hand side of the hotbar you can see A gravity and P gravity. P gravity is your planetary gravity. That's your natural gravity. Once that reads 0, we're in space and we will keep on moving in whatever direction we're moving unless we apply thrust to ourselves. Or hit something. There'll be nothing to pull this ship down again. And that will drop from 0.05 to 0 like you just saw there, and now we're just moving. My thrust override is at 0, our speed is staying at 94.54 meters per second. If I turn on my reverse thrusters, we'll start slowing down, and we'll have to use fuel to do so. It's worth keeping that in mind, because any acceleration you do in space is something you're going to have to counteract yourself, which means that if you're willing to, you can conserve fuel by moving more slowly between the asteroids. For now, I'm going to turn on my braking thrusters, we're going to slow down, and then we're going to use the camera to try and help us spot an asteroid we'd like to find. The first thing I'd really like to find is some ice, as that will allow us to stay up here much longer. So we'll press G, we'll grab our camera, and we'll select View from the options here. So now it's in our 9th slot on our hotbar. If we press 9, we jump into the camera's view. You can still control your ship, as you can see the drill is turning with me. But the nice thing about the camera is we can also zoom in with our mouse wheel and get a bit of a closer look at some of the asteroids around here. That one looks like it's got suspiciously bluish coloured stuff, which might be worth looking at a bit more closely to see whether it's ice. These ones we can't really make out. Sometimes you won't be able to make out anything too useful. That's a moon, not an asteroid. Can't spot much on that one. This camera technique is not 100% reliable, but it can give you a useful indication of something that's very densely made up of ice, or something that, like this one you can see here, has a red splotch on it. That is almost certainly going to be iron. So we're not too interested in that one. Now, where's that blue one I spotted? Is that this one? Yeah, let's head for that. I'm suspicious this one's going to be cobalt, not ice, but it's not too far away, so we'll head to it first. If you want to get out of the camera view, press F, and you'll return to the perspective you were in before. In order to conserve fuel, we're going to turn off our inertial dampeners. So now, any deceleration we do will have to be performed by ourselves. We're also, for safety reasons, not going to target straight at that asteroid. What we're going to do is target just off to the side of it. This means if we forget to slow down, we're not going to run straight into it. So we can accelerate now, and we'll go up to say 50-ish meters per second. So we're almost at the asteroid. I'm going to hit Z to turn on my inertial dampeners, slow down. If I wanted to slow down more quickly, I could face my large thruster in the direction I'm moving. But I'm pretty happy with that. You can see my spotlights have started lighting up the asteroid. You can see some of that blue colored stuff. Turn my detector on. You can see we got magnesium. It's not cobalt, it's magnesium. But we did pick up ice. So I've been very, very lucky here in that I've managed to find ice right from the outset, which is quite handy. What you want to do whenever you find an asteroid up here is to mark it with a GPS marker. What you've found on it, so that you don't try and go back and look at that one again, or if you need something, you know where to find it again. So ice, magnesium. And that way, as I scout more and more of these asteroids, I'll be able to know which ones I've been to and which ones I want to go back to collect stuff before I go down to Earth. And just to ensure I have plenty of fuel, I'm going to drill out some of this ice while we're here. So to pick our next culprit, let's go back into our camera and see what else we've got around here. I'm deliberately avoiding the asteroids that are really close to the Earth. Some of them will be inside the gravity well of the planet, and I wouldn't like to search those yet since I'll have to burn fuel to resist gravity at those asteroids. I'd rather stay a little bit further out and avoid that. So let's head off to this collection of asteroids here. I don't know what it's got, but let's find out. I've got all the time in the world, or 3 hours, before I have to get back to the planet, so I'm willing to spend a bit of extra time traveling between the asteroids in order to save that fuel. Even though I probably don't need to since I've collected quite a bit of ice. Right now you can see 2 red tags on my HUD. One saying Space Pirate Salvage Station, and the other one saying Space Pirate Rust Freighter. Both of those are armed, and that salvage station is probably going to send drones after me if I get too close. So, since I have no armaments aboard this thing and my only ability to avoid getting damaged is to run away, I am going to keep well and truly clear of them. If you're interested in more detail about what NPC stuff is available in vanilla, there'll be a link in the top right that'll take you through to a video that I've done before with a bit more detail on that. Something to note about asteroids is they are just as solid as a planet. Even a tiny asteroid like this one in front of me will not budge if I run into it. It will destroy me, so I want to steer clear of any voxel material, since all voxel material in Space Engineers is completely solid and rigid and fixed. Another thing to note now that we're up in space is that we will need to have our helmet on when we get out. Press J before you hop out and make sure that your helmet icon shows up as mine is now, over on the left of my HUD. Helmet off, helmet on. That way you won't get injured. If you take your helmet off while you're outside... Oh geez, I'm getting shot. That's... What the heck? Oh, cheeky. See what I mean about those drones? They are nasty. That thing doesn't even have an antenna on it. Urgh. Rude. Interrupting my tutorial. Well... I didn't get a chance to show you my helmet being off being a problem, but I did get to prove that those drones can be quite vicious. There are a few bullet holes in this thing right now. Thankfully, it all seems to still be intact. Now that the drone seems to have left us behind, if I take my helmet off while I'm outside the ship, I will get injured, quite rapidly too. So best to avoid that. The other thing to avoid is running out of hydrogen while you're outside the ship. Because once you do, all you can do is flip yourself around. You cannot do anything else. You are stuck and you will have to wait until you suffocate or freeze to death. Or, if you press backspace, you can respawn at your nearest respawn location. And if you've gone up as early as I have, you will respawn back down on the Earth, which is not what you want. I've now put myself in a situation that you might run into if you're up in space using hydrogen thrusters. And that is running out of fuel. I have 2% fuel left in my fuel tank. That's what the H2 gauge on the right hand side is. It indicates the amount of hydrogen in your tanks. It doesn't tell you anything about the amount of ice in your O2H2 generators or any of that. So what can we do in this situation? Well, I've got a decent amount of hydrogen in my personal tanks, and my bottle is almost full as well. So we should be able to fly to a nearby asteroid and collect some ice to manually refuel the ship. Or, if we're in relative proximity to a planet, and we've got atmospheric thrusters or parachutes that are capable of softly landing us, we can simply point at the planet, turn off our inertial dampeners, and blast till we get up to the highest speed we can so that this doesn't take terribly long. And in this case, I can get pretty much up to top speed. And then we just coast. Now I'm going to be heading at terminal velocity all the way down to the planet until I turn my atmospheric thrusters back on, and then we'll be able to come in for a nice, safe landing at our base. Inertial dampeners on and thrusters on, now that we're in thick enough atmosphere for everything to work. Hopefully our few minutes of power will be enough to get back to base and safely land. Because, it's a little bit tight. There we go, safely back at base. This thing's pretty big, so I'm going to show you some silly but still effective ways to make it up to orbit. You can very easily just build a few hydrogen bottles, shove them in your suit, and fly up there straight away. Not exactly the most helpful way to get up to space though, because you can't bring much back and you can't do much up there with just what's in your suit. Unless you're playing on higher inventory settings where you can carry more stuff. This is one of the other ridiculous ways you can get up to space. All this is a cockpit, an O2H2 generator, some batteries, a thruster, and a gyroscope. And this, if we fill it up with ice, which I've done, will get us all the way up into space. Slowly, but it will get us there. And there we go, we've made it to space, once with a useful craft and once with this thing that's about to run out of power in about 14 seconds. Next time we're going to take a look at refineries, assemblers, and upgrade modules, and some base design stuff that I usually go through when I'm building a proper ground-based base. So there's all that, and plenty more to come, and I will see you then.